Hey everybody, welcome back to mdo204. This is class 6. In this class we're going to finish the dynamic shattering of our shards. We're going to set up the render and then take it into Nuke for final compositing. But before we do that, I wanted to cover a few things that were in the forums. One of those are shortcuts, and while we won't cover all of the shortcuts, I'll show you some neat tips and tricks. And then we're going to talk about applying materials and textures to our shattered objects and how we might go about doing that. So let's jump right in. Alright, so here we are in Modo, and this is the final setup for this scene that I've created. I made a few more changes which I'll run you guys through. But before we do that, shortcut number 1, if your viewport starts to get sluggish because you have it on OpenGL or shaded, what you can do is hit Control 2. That'll give you a pop-up pie menu where you can easily select something else such as wireframe. And you'll notice that wireframe will move a lot smoother for you. It's the same as coming up here and clicking this drop-down menu, only that you can access it from anywhere in the screen. So if I come to shaded, we can see it's a little bit sluggish trying to render that in shaded view. So I could simply just change it to solid, which is going to be way faster, a little bit harder to see. One of the things that we could do is hit O for our overlay menu and come to active meshes, and we can just turn up the opacity of our wireframe here, and that'll be easier for us to see. Another shortcut, which you guys probably are familiar with, is Control Tab, which will allow you to choose a different layout. So I can just hit Control Tab and go to a different layout. I prefer the tabbed layout. That's what I use by default, but we could easily jump to a different layout, such as the layout, and then jump back to, let's say, the model one, and then jump back to tabbed. It's just a fast way to navigate. I kind of just like having mine tabbed up here, but I'm going to come out to the layout tab, show you what I did to set this up. So if I hit 0 with my mouse over any window, that'll bring it full screen. Likewise over here, if I hit 0, that'll bring that full screen too. So what I've done is I've cached this simulation. I made a whole bunch of new cuts and shatters in here. And what I have is 3 spheres that are going to be penetrating this object up here. So in my solver, what I've done is I've turned off the gravity here, and then under advanced, usually timescale is set to 100%, but I set it to 33% to kind of slow things down. And then each one of these balls here that is has an upward Newton force on it. We can see that here under impulse, that I've set this one to 45. And I have this starting at frame 8. This one starting at the very first frame. This has a upward Newton impulse of 50. And then this guy right here, the bigger one, starts at frame 12. So just to speed this up, I'm going to switch to wireframe mode. And if I jump to my camera view and just scrub through the timeline, you can see that those impacts are offset. The first impact hits, the second one is hitting with a little bit more force, and then the third one comes in to push everything out of the way. So this is a pretty heavy sim. It took a while to make all the shatter cuts on each one of these. What I did is basically I did an overall cut of everything, then middle mouse clicking and dragging, I selected a few of the objects, did like 3 to 5 cuts, then I got in there and selected a few more interior objects. If you're middle mouse clicking, you're actually going to select these through everything, so I didn't actually have these there yet. So middle mouse click and drag, and then come over and shatter these, and then so on and so forth until I got to the really small pieces, and then shattered those. So that's basically how I set this up. And then obviously under setup, we can click here to cache this sim, and we have what you see happening. And then it was pretty easy from there. That's what I love about Modo. I was able to hit F6, use the shards thing that we saved out, and just apply that material. I chose a nice environment to put in there that gives us nice reflections, and I dialed in just a few more things. So that's what's changed, and that's what's going to come in the final render. I'll save that out for you guys. But really quickly, I wanted to run through some really cool shortcuts. And that's basically control and numbers. So if I hit control 1, this will allow me to toggle on and off certain things. For instance, if I want to see cameras, I can click that and I can see my cameras now, or if I want to turn them off because they're in the way. Same with my lights. Then I can also toggle my grid work plane. If I just want to focus on something, turn that back on. Or if let's say I was in shaded view, which is control 2 will give us that pop up. And just to double check, if I hit 0 and come over to inactive meshes, I can make inactive same as active, which means I don't have to have that object selected to actually see it. It's always going to be represented in shaded. That's also a faster way to work if your viewport gets sluggish because you have a lot of geo or something, or a lot of textures in there. You could simply, if you hit O, come over. So now it's only going to shade what's active. So that's shaded, that's shaded, that's shaded. But it's kind of hard to see since these are transparent. So I'm just going to change that back to make inactive same as active. I think my graphics card can handle it. Control 3 will give you even more pop-up menus. I can launch a shader tree really quick. Control 4 will give me some topology tools here. Control 5, Control 6, which is basically just what we did, so I could easily come in and go invisible, same as active. So those are nice little shortcuts to navigate within your viewport here. Now there's plenty more shortcuts. I'll start calling them out as I do them, but one other thing that I wanted to mention is that there's tons of shortcuts, and you can set up your own shortcuts if you want as well, which once you become a little bit more advanced, I definitely recommend. That way you can work the way you like, which means you're going to work faster. So another question that came up would be how to hide all the internal fractures within our shattered mesh object, and then how we might go about applying like a wood texture to everything. So as for hiding the internal fractures within this object, there's really no good way to do that. And that's because on frame 0, where nothing is shattered, basically you have all of this geometry on the inside of this shattered object. Might be easier to see here. And although it is one piece in the sense that everything's there, all of these faces that are butting up against each other are actually two physical polygons. So naturally it's going to refract light when that happens. So let me just save this, and I'm going to start a new scene for you guys and show you two ways of working and how to apply those textures. So here we are in a new scene, and I just wanted to show you one methodology of how to do this. So if I just simply create a shape here, that looks good for now. So I have my mesh item here, and let's just say I have all the vertices selected. A cool thing I can do is if I hit Alt, I can click on any of these up here to convert this to just the lines of this mesh item, or hit Alt and convert this to the polygons, which is what I want to do. I'm gonna hit Shift D, which is faceted subdivide, which is just gonna cut this up and give us a little bit more geometry to work with. That's exactly what I want. And then I'm gonna come over to geometry, mesh shader uniform, and just do this, set it to 10, and voila, there we have it. Now you'll notice I have all of my mesh shards here nicely in this folder, but the other thing I still have is my original mesh item, which if I turn this on, you can see is not fractured or shattered or anything like that. So it still keeps my original piece of geometry. So with that being said, we could easily apply the same texture to this guy and turn him off, and then turn the shattered grouping on the moment of impact, which will basically swap it out. However, one of the things I would recommend doing is actually rendering both, and then in compositing, you could easily generate yourself a mask within Modo, or mask it off and nuke between the shattered and unshattered version to make it fracture kind of where you want. So I'm actually going to delete this shards folder and then show you another thing. So if we come over to the paint tab, I'm just going to come to the top view, and I'm going to run through this pretty quickly. I'll let you guys explore this on your own. I don't want to take too much time here, and this is not necessarily advanced, but not something that I want to go too in depth with. There's tons of materials out there. There's tons of stuff out there if you guys want to go a little bit deeper with this, but let me just show you this too. Under Paint Tools, Airbrush, I'm going to click Image Ink, and then I'm going to pull this up so we can see it a little bit better. Under Image Ink here, this might say None. I've already chosen a texture previously, so I'm just going to choose Bark right here. And then if I click in my viewport, it'll bring up this nice little layover, which I can manipulate here. So if I place this right here, I can spin it. And then right now I have mine set to stamp. If I unselect this, it'll be a paint down through, but I'm just going to click stamp, and then click in my viewport. Now if I hit spacebar to drop the tools, you can see what's happened is I've stamped that texture down onto my mesh item. If we come over to UV, we can see that this top area here now has this texture here. And this is basically the default UV for the simple shape I've created. So if we come back to Model, hit Control 2 and come over to Advanced GL, we can see that that texture's there. Now with this item selected, I'm going to come over to Geometry, and I'm going to go to Mesh Shader Uniform, and I'll just shatter this quite a bit. So here's the cool thing. This item here, each one of these individual items, it has kept the UV image where I had it before. Only now it's given me an interior material for these fractured inward pieces, which I could easily apply a texture to or something of the sort. And of course I still have my original mesh item right here. So I'm actually going to delete this again and show you one more thing. And for this, I'm just going to delete this texture group and pretend that we accidentally shattered this before we applied anything to it. And I'm going to delete this original mesh item. So let's say we just have this pre-fractured set of mesh items. So what do we do in this case? Well, we can come over to UV, and then from here I'm going to go to top view. You might see this, you might not. What we're going to do is come over to lists, and then we're going to click on UV maps, and I'm just going to delete this texture map that was by default, and then click on new map, and we'll just keep it called texture for simplicity. So if I select these top polygons only, and then click on project from view, and click in the viewport here, it'll put all of these polygons into this UV space, and then I can simply come over and click on pack UVs, which will lay out these UVs quite nicely. And actually I'm going to call this top view, and we can see that if we select any one of these pieces on the top view, it will have a corresponding area on our UV map. So what I'm going to do is select these top pieces here, and then hit M for material, and just call this top. So now what we can do is come back over to paint, airbrush, image ink, select, make sure that you have stamp on, click to stamp that down, and what it's going to do is you can stamp this on each one of these individual pieces. So if we deselect that, come back to the model, we can see that we have each one of these pieces now has the corresponding texture on it. Now keep in mind that this is a longer and potentially very arduous way about going about it. So you might want to set everything up at the beginning the right way, so you avoid a massive headache and hassle like this. But this would be a last case scenario of how to save your object from absolute disaster if you needed to do this. So I hope that helped answer a few questions, and for the rest of you, you learned a little something about setting up your textures on shattered objects. UVs aren't exactly the funnest thing to do, but they are absolutely necessary if you are going to be shattering complex objects that have many different image maps and textures and things like that. Anyway, I'm going to hop back over into our other class project once it's done rendering, and then we're going to pull it into Nuke. So let's go do that now. Alright, render is finished, and here we are inside of Nuke. So I'm going to hit R and navigate to where my renders are and select that and click open. Alternatively, I could simply just go to the folder and drag the folder that has the renders in it into my node graph, and that will drop it there as well. So I'm going to hit 1 to connect this up to a viewer, give it a little bit more space, and for time purposes and file size, I kept this render to 600 by 253, but that won't matter because this still is an EXR file with all of our layers. So one of the things that we could do to see all the different layers that are in here, hit tab and type in layer contact sheet. So what layer contact sheet will do, if we hook this up and hit 1 or 2 to look through it, it will show us all of the different layers within this EXR. So I'll click show layer names and we can see all the different passes that we have. So now I can jump back and forth by hitting 1 and 2 between these two viewer inputs. And if we come over here, we can also look at our channels by clicking on this, and this will show us all of our individual channels. So if we wanted to look at just our specular shading, we could see that here. If we scrub through it, we can see all the different specular shading happening. So don't get confused here. Normally we're going to want to keep this on RGBA, but we can view the individual channels if we need to. Sometimes people get confused because they'll be looking at, let's say, they'll be stuck on specular and it just doesn't look right, and they'll be like, what the heck? I'm looking at all my different channels within here, such as R, G, B, and A, and I don't see what is happening, but that's probably just because you're viewing the wrong channel itself. So what can we do with this? How can we deconstruct and reconstruct this? Well, there are many ways. First of all, let's just play this back so we can see what's happening. If I hit red, green, and blue, and you'll see that changing up here to go to my different layers, and then hit A, which will show us the alpha for this as well. And it looks pretty good. There's a little bit of noisiness in here. That would be something that I would have to change in the render, but I do not have a render farm at my house, and I was trying to kick this out in a timely fashion for you guys. Rendering is a very vast topic. You're probably going to want to do your own tests and stuff on a frame or two, especially with one that has a lot more refraction and reflection going on. I would say on this scene, maybe something like frame 75 would, for me, would be a good test frame to see, dial in these settings to get the lowest noise but the best result. But this will do. The other thing I want to mention too, for all of these little intricacies here, to really get a good depth blur happening, we would want to actually do this within our render. It gets a little bit hairy when you start using your depth pass to blend this, especially with transparency and all these little intricacies of something in front of many objects in front of you know, all the background objects and stuff like that. But I spit out a depth pass anyway. But this is good, and we're really not going to focus too much on the artistic side of this. We're going to just look at how we can use these passes to deconstruct and reconstruct. So there's two thoughts behind this. One of this would be to shuffle out all your different layers and reconstruct them that way. So basically we would pull in a shuffle node, and if we look through this, we can select and shuffle out these different layers here. So diffuse shading total, and if we just gamma up here, we can see there is some information in this channel. If we were to change this to specular, we could see all of our specular hits here, or we could change this to transparent. And our transparent is basically going to house all of our different dispersion and things that are going to be within our transparency. So what we want to do is break out each one of these individually. So I'm just going to read in a different shuffle. Pull this over, and I'm going to set this shuffle to reflection. Copy and paste this over here. Move it up and set this to specular. And the last layer that we have that I rendered is going to be transparent. So if I hit M to bring in a merge, I'm going to set this to plus. So I'm going to plus my diffuse shading total with my reflection shading output. And I can select this, copy and paste, hit Shift X to switch inputs, Not necessary because you're just plussing them together, but I like to keep things organized. And one more time. So if we look at this, the bottom of this node here versus our actual render input, we can see that it's a 1-to-1 node difference. One thing we might want to do is use an unpremult and divide all channels. So basically what that'll do is it'll unpremult everything. So when we put this back together and look at this, we can see that these edges here are being unpremulted. And then what we do is hit K for copy. And let me just hook this up the right way. Copy that alpha back in and then put a premult at the bottom. And let's just make this a little bit more tidy. So now 1-to-1, absolutely no difference between those two. And what this will do is by unpremulting this, anywhere within this chain we could add a grade node. And so here we know that we're going to be grading the transparent shading output. If we wanted to, we could click on the node graph here and just type in transparent and set this up so we have all of the so we can visually represent all of the different channels that we're actually shuffling out. So now basically if we were to grade this, let me just set this up. So if we were to grade this now, and let's make sure that we're looking at 2. If we were to gain this down, it would basically pull that completely out of our scene. Or we could simply add some red into it, pull red out of it. This might be a little bit more apparent on, let's say, a specular. So let's find a good scene where there's a nice big specular hit, such as this. So I'm going to add a grade node to that and just call this spec. So we know that this is our specular channel. So with our grade node selected on our specular channel, I'm going to change the specularity to be very blue and pull everything else out of it. Now this is obviously a very strong example, but if we hit D to disable this, we can see that there's blue specularity happening now within this. So I'm going to change this to say reflect, add a grade node here. So we're going to make that blue. And then let's see. So this brightness here is coming from our transparent channel. We can see that the reflection is, or the specular is now blue. So if we look here, it's adding a little bit of white back in. So another thing that we could do, add a color correct and then come to highlights, and under our gain we could push some blue back into that, and it's just very subtle, but we can see that there's a difference. Now you want to be careful that you don't crunch your values too hard. So you can see how you can push and pull these individual channels around to get a look that you might want. So this is a very traditional method of just shuffling your channels out and rebuilding them. But there's another way that you could do this. So I'm going to copy and paste this over here. And we'll look through this. So right now we're looking at the beauty of this actual image. So if I hit M and hook up the B channel also to the same input, I'm going to select operation from over to from, and on my A side, I'm going to remove diffuse shading total from my B side, which is my beauty. So you can see there's a little bit of a change there. It's pulling something out. And then I'm going to hit M for another merge. Hook both the A and the B side up again. Set that to from and set that to reflection shading output. So now we're removing that channel. And I'm going to do this one more time. Do this again. Set that to specular. And one more time, and we should be left with absolutely nothing. And set that to transparent. So now I've systematically removed each channel from this here. So now I'm going to add an unpremult and set this to all. And I'm going to hit another merge. Set this to plus. And what I can do is rebuild this. Just by using merges, setting them to plus, and plussing back in those channels. And then if I put a premult at the end, this should be 1-to-1 now with this layer here. So this is another way of just setting this up, and this is keeping it basically in line. Let me just give this a little bit more real estate for you guys to see. And now what you could do is, under your unpremult, add a few grade nodes and set the channels to the individual channels that you wanted to grade. The nice thing about this is it will tell you which channel it's set to. And now under here we can just use these grade nodes. Let me just make sure I'm looking through this. And we can pull out those individual channels, dial them down, add color to them. So we know that transparent shading output has a little bit of red and the rest of the values have been pulled back a little bit. You can toggle that off and on. And then at the very bottom here we could add what's called the remove node. So what I'd want to do is set this to keep, and I'm just going to keep my RGBA. So it'll keep my beauty, my new beauty basically, and my alpha. And if I go to depth, we won't see my depth because basically it's removing all of those channels. If I need them later, I can pipe down the individual channel that I wanted. But this is also a clean and inline method of recomping your CG. So since this has alpha, we could easily put this on top of a space background or any background really that we wanted. And you can see that it has a nice red tint to it now. So these are basically two methods of reconstructing your CG here. A lot of cool things, many different ways to comp your CG back together again. And from here all you need to do is hit W for your write node. Basically select the folder where you'd want to write this out to, set up all your parameters and click render, and that will give you your final image sequence or your final QuickTime. So I hope you guys enjoyed this part of the class. Next week should be super fun when we get into the actual spaceship itself and start building a shot. As always, if you have any questions, please ask them in the forums, and I'd love to see your works in progress. I hope you guys have a good week, and I will see you next week in Class 7. Alright, take care.